A network survives by being broken first. That was the truth Paul Baran discovered while the world still believed communication was safest when it moved in straight lines. A signal, a voice, a command that traveled from point A to point B. A bridge suspended over calm water, but bridges fall. Wires snap. Towers collapse. And in a Cold War America shaped by sirens and mushroom clouds, Baran knew that one direct path would never hold. In a single strike, a nation's voice could be erased. So he imagined something else. A system where the message did not travel. Whole, but fragmented itself like shattered glass, each shard carrying part of the truth. And only when reunited would it speak again. This was not just science. It was survival. Yet when he explained it, they stared as if he were unraveling madness. When he warned of the threat, they smiled as if he had imagined too much. When he offered the solution, they buried it beneath. Bureaucracy. He worked in concrete buildings under artificial light. His diagrams were typed, bound, sent to men in suits who could not read the future through circuits. His designs laid the bones for what would become the internet, but not under his name. His warnings became blueprints, but signed by others. And so the world spun toward the digital age with Baran walking in its shadow. When we send a message now, when we stream, upload, call, or post, we trust that the system will heal itself if broken. That is the foundation he laid, not because he wanted recognition, but because he feared silence more than death. The next time your phone pings or your screen refreshes, remember this: it was built from fragments. And Paul Baran was the one who taught them how to return home. The year was 1959, and the world pulsed with tension wrapped in routine. In American suburbs, children rode bicycles under mushroom-shaped clouds, painted in classroom safety drills, while television sets hummed softly in every living room, broadcasting smiles that trembled behind the glass. Beneath that calm surface, military planners whispered about unthinkable futures in windowless rooms where the air smelled like paper, dust, and ink. The Cold War had reshaped everything into a theater of invisible war, an arms race with no finish. Line a silence so thick it could drown entire cities before a single bomb dropped. Inside the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, a quiet man walked into a conference room with a folder tucked beneath his arm and a storm inside his chest. Paul Baran wore no uniform, but his mind carried blueprints more dangerous than any warhead. He did not arrive with speeches or applause, just equations, charts, a model, and a warning. What if the communication lines fall first? What if a nuclear blast cuts off the orders before they are spoken? What if silence becomes the final weapon? He had mapped the fractures already, before the world even saw them. The telecommunication networks, massive centralized systems, were fragile by design. Destroy one central node and the entire map goes dark. But Baran had an idea: scatter the message, break it, let it travel like droplets through a storm. It would arrive whole again, only when all parts had returned. A network that would live not in straight lines, but in resilience. They stared at him with thin smiles and still bodies. No one spoke for a long time. Outside traffic passed like nothing had changed. Inside the room, a new world had been born. But no one knew what to do with it. That room, that moment, that silence. It was where the internet took its first breath. Not in a lab filled with blinking lights. Not with the push of a button. But in a quiet refusal to let human voices die just because wires could. And no one applauded. Paul Baran had never been the kind of man who sought the stage or the spotlight. Born in Grodno when it belonged to Poland, but raised in Philadelphia among immigrants who carried silence like a second skin, Baran learned early how to listen deeper than words. He watched the way machines moved, how voices trembled on radio. Waves, how distance meant nothing if you understood the language of signals. As a boy, he built circuits out of discarded radios, not to speak louder, but to speak safer. That instinct for protection never left him. At Drexel, while others memorized theory, he reshaped it, fitting new ideas into old frames until the frames cracked. At UCLA, he delved into engineering with a kind of hunger born not from ambition, but from fear that the world was balancing on something far too thin. He understood what most could not see. The future would not belong to those with louder weapons, but to those with better communication. And if that communication could not survive disaster, then it had already failed. In his quiet hours, he drew diagrams that looked more like constellations than circuits networks, with no center, no weak point, no master switch. He imagined messages flowing like breath into a shattered body, each piece finding its way back to the heart. Others saw chaos in his sketches. He saw survival. Every part of him, the immigrant son, the Jewish outsider, the engineer, the observer, fed into a vision of the world that trusted no central tower, no single authority. Baran believed that truth should not depend on a single voice, that freedom should not hang on a single wire. He did not speak like a prophet. He wrote like an architect of something too large to build. But it would be built, just not by the hands that dreamed it first. The resistance did not come all at once. It crept in like fog filling a quiet valley, slow and cold and absolute. When Paul Baran presented his ideas to a T&T, the room smelled of polished wood and overconfidence. They wore suits pressed with tradition and minds lined with legacy. The idea of packet switching, of breaking messages into small digital chunks that traveled separately, struck them as not just strange, but dangerous. These were men who had built empires on continuous lines of copper, who believed control meant ownership, and ownership meant stability. To scatter data into fragments felt like handing over order to chaos. They told him it would never work. They told him it should never work. They asked why anyone would want to destroy a message just to deliver it. He tried to explain the strength in that destruction, the way fragmentation made the system unkillable, how a bomb could not silence a nation if no single center held its voice. But they had already decided. They saw a threat to their business, not a shield for the future. So they turned their backs politely, with firm handshakes and empty eyes. Others followed. Conference after conference closed their doors. Reports sat unread. Baran's logic was flawless, his data uncheckable, but the culture around him ran on ego, not evidence. He began to sense something more insidious, not ignorance, but fear. Fear of change. Fear of a world where no one entity controlled the entire line. Fear that power might slip through the cracks he was creating. He walked the halls of Rand like a ghost with blueprints that no one would hold. And yet he returned each day, drew new diagrams, filed new papers, not because he believed he would win, but because he could not abandon the truth that lived inside those lines. Even when the world dismissed him, he kept building the skeleton of the digital age, knowing full well he might never see it rise. Then came the moment where theory collided with danger, and Paul Baran stood on the edge of a revelation that would not just challenge the system, it would expose it. The Rand Corporation tasked him with a question wrapped in dread. How would America communicate if every major city lay in ruins? If Washington vanished in fire? If phone lines melted beneath the heat of nuclear warheads? Most men would have drafted emergency protocols or fallback centers. Baran did not. He reimagined the entire map. He built simulations where messages leapt like sparks across a grid, detouring through the ruins, reassembling on the other side, untouched by destruction. It was not just practical, it was unkillable. What he proposed was a network immune to annihilation, where each node was equally powerful, where no single failure broke the chain. A mesh of voices. a democratic web. And within it he buried a prophecy, the blueprint of packet switching. Break every message. Send each fragment us. Different way. Make the system so decentralized that no enemy could silence it. In internal tests, it worked flawlessly. In closed-room war games, it held when all else collapsed. He had created a skeleton that could hold up not just under pressure, but under apocalypse. But when Baran took his findings to a T&T again, they refused with greater force. They claimed it would shatter their infrastructure, that it introduced too many unknowns. But behind the excuses was a truth Baran had suspected. His invention made their control obsolete. They did not want a network that could think for itself. They wanted wires they could own. So they closed the door. The project was shelved. The reports buried in government cabinets. Baran walked away not in failure, but in mourning. He had offered the world a machine that could outlive war, and they turned their backs. Years later, when ARPANET emerged, built on the bones of his work, it bore no mention of his name, but the architecture was unmistakable. The world had used his vision to protect itself, and then forgotten the eyes that saw it first. Paul Baran did not collapse with noise, but with silence. After the final rejection by the titans of communication, something inside him dimmed quietly, like a room losing heat. He continued working at RAND for a time, still sharpening ideas that no one dared to build, still solving problems others had not even seen yet. But the flame of urgency faded from his voice. He stopped pushing, stopped proposing. It was not that he lost faith in his ideas. It was that he saw how easily truth could drown beneath bureaucracy. The system would not bend to logic. It would not reward vision. It would only move when the world burned. And Baran could no longer burn alone, so he stepped away. He left the future behind and shifted to smaller roles, quieter jobs, places where genius no longer frightened the room. To outsiders, he seemed content, maybe even peaceful. But those closest to him saw the cost nights spent staring at blank pages, shelves stacked with unread reports, the silence that stretched after every story he told about what could have been. He never chased fame. That was never the point. But to watch the world stumble toward the very system he had described in such brutal detail, and to never be called back into the room, that was a wound no theory could heal. When others began claiming credit for concepts that traced directly back to his diagrams, he said nothing. When interviews asked about the early days of the internet, and his name was missing from their credits, he did not correct them. Not out of pride, out of exhaustion. He had lived too far ahead for too long. And the world rarely honors the man who builds the foundation. It worships only the tower. Years passed like shadows, slipping through broken blinds, and while the world raced into digital revolution, Paul Baran remained an invisible architect watching from the edges of history. But deep within dusty archives at RAND Corporation, and buried among footnotes and declassified military memos, a hidden truth began to whisper louder than the myths replacing it. Quietly, researchers unearthed diagrams that mirrored the structure of modern digital networks' packet switching flowcharts, drawn in Baran's own hand years before anyone else spoke those words aloud. The structure of ARPANET, the very system that would evolve into the internet, was eerily aligned with the blueprints Baran had submitted and had been told to forget. Emails surfaced between military officials, referencing Baran's early work often, quoting him without naming him. And in quiet corners of engineering communities, experts began to say it plainly. This system was not born from those who implemented it, but from the man who dreamed it before it was safe to speak. Baran had seen the fractures before they formed. He had written the remedy long before the illness was diagnosed. One internal review from the early 1970s even admitted that the Department of Defense had drawn directly from Baran's work without consultation. Yet his name never crossed the lips of those who testified before Congress or those awarded medals for innovation. The Internet rose like a monument built from unseen bricks and faceless labor. But in every signal broken and restored every message split and reassembled every route that finds a new path. When the old one dies, Baran's fingerprints remain. He had created resilience from ruin, a language of survival that now holds the modern world in place. The only thing missing was the name etched beneath it. The silence was no longer just bureaucratic. It had become historical. And that silence spoke more loudly than recognition ever could. Paul Baran died on March 26, 2011, and the world barely stirred. The same world that pulsed with wireless voices, the same world that streamed laughter across continents and whispered secrets through satellite links, offered only a whisper for the man who made it all possible. There were no grand tributes, no state honors, no glowing headlines. A few quiet obituaries marked his passing, tucked into the back pages of tech journals and buried among trending noise. He passed away in Palo Alto, a city that thrived on digital. Fire built atop the bones of forgotten minds. His final days were not marked by bitterness, but by a calm detachment, as if he had long accepted that invention and recognition lived on different timelines. He had once feared a world silenced by destruction. Now he watched a world deafened by convenience. In his final moments, there were no machines bearing his name, no corporate towers or tech campuses draped in his memory. There were only stories, half remembered in diagrams still stored in old cabinets marked confidential. Yet outside his window, the Internet pulsed like a heartbeat, humming with every fragmented message, every bouncing signal, every patch of broken data reassembled into clarity. All of it echoed from the system he once built in a room no one remembers. He did not vanish into legend. He vanished into the very code of daily life. A ghost in the machine, not haunting it but holding it together. His disappearance was not sudden, it was slow erasure, like static fading from a forgotten frequency. And the world moved forward, never knowing it was still walking through the corridors of his imagination. After his death, something strange happened, not loudly, not all at once, but like a radio signal growing clearer after years of static. A new generation of technologists began asking different questions. They searched through early documents, blueprints, timelines, and one name appeared again and again in the margins, not shouted from headlines, but written in the quiet language of origin. Paul Baran. His diagrams became essential reading for students. In computer science, his theories turned from dusty speculation to undeniable foundation. In time, small documentaries whispered the truth, and a few academic conferences began to refer to him as what he truly was, the father of resilient digital communication. The irony cut deep. Baran had been pushed aside for suggesting a decentralized system, but now that system governed everything. From online banking to battlefield drones, from emergency alerts to global stock trades, all relied on the very architecture he imagined while others dismissed him. Even the most powerful tech companies, the ones built on centralized control, used his decentralized genius to scale beyond their own limits. The irony hardened into something tragic. The world he designed rose without his name on its spine. It celebrated figures who came later, louder, richer. But their success was grown from a garden he planted when the soil was radioactive with doubt. The aftermath of his work lay not in statues or textbooks, but in your phone, your messages, your unseen faith that no single broken piece can silence the whole. This was Paul Baran's gift. The truth he delivered quietly while others laughed. And now every corner of the digital world hums with his legacy built on fragments that always find their way home. The world often forgets the architects of its survival, choosing instead to praise those who arrive after the dust settles, wearing crowns fashioned from someone else's silence. Paul Baran never sought applause. He never demanded loyalty from the future he built. But now that future surrounds us in every flicker of wireless connection, every message that survives, collapse every signal that bends instead of breaking. His dream was not luxury, it was protection, and yet we live inside it, unaware that the invisible armor shielding our digital lives was forged by a man who walked away from his own invention without bitterness. But what does it mean to inherit a world and never know who saved it before it began? What do we become when the very foundation of our civilization is stitched from forgotten hands? Paul Baran envisioned a humanity that could survive not through dominance but through adaptability, not by building walls, but by scattering strength into every corner of the map. And in doing so, he offered us a way to endure, a blueprint for communication immune to tyranny, censorship, disaster. So now, as our systems grow more complex, as control tightens and networks centralize again, ask yourself, what are we losing by forgetting the man who taught us how not to break? Who else among us carries visions too early, too strange, too true to be understood? And if the world buried Paul Baran beneath its own noise, what other futures have we already silenced before they could speak? His name may remain unfamiliar to millions, but his design lives inside the pulse of the planet. And every time a broken message finds its way back to meaning, he lives again.